Garrett Walsh had lived 36 winters, each one etching lines into his face that spoke of burdens heavier than his years suggested. The absence of a wife left a hollowness in his dwelling. No offspring to inherit his land, no companion to share the evening hours. His cabin stood alone, its timbers darkened by countless seasons and storms. When darkness fell, he occupied his chair by the flames in solitude, did the seat opposite, as vacant as the other side of his sleeping quarters. Those who knew him in the settlement spoke first of his stature before mentioning his character. The mountain man, they called him, powerful as a draft horse, hands capable of crushing stone. Yet his truth resided not in physical might, but in his reticence. He avoided the drinking establishments and spurned the camaraderie of neighbors. His words were scarce, his world even smaller. That particular evening, the atmosphere hung thick and oppressive, laden with the scent of timber and approaching snow, when a noise struck against his door. It wasn't the wind's whisper or branches scraping wood. It was purposeful, a knock, both urgent and frightened. Garrett paused. Timber clutched in his arms, his head lifting as every sense heightened in the stillness. No visitor arrived after nightfall, particularly not during winter, not without compelling cause. He lowered the wood deliberately, approached the entrance, and pulled it open with cautious hands. There she stood, small as a sparrow and nearly as delicate. A young girl barely 7 years. Her locks tangled and moistened by snow. Her face marked with red blotches from the bitter cold. She wore merely a threadbare dress, frayed at the edges, her shoes so deteriorated the toes protruded, exposed. Her eyes were enormous, not from the cold alone, but from terror that had settled deeper than any frost. She gazed upward at him, a towering shadow blocking the doorway, and spoke words that hung suspended like vapor from dying embers. "They've hurt my mother. She's suffering too much." Garrett felt those words strike against the quietness of his dwelling, reverberating in places he'd thought long sealed. For a moment, he remained motionless. The girl's lips quivered, yet no tears fell. She had already exhausted her supply. She stood with a desperate composure no child should possess, holding herself as if stillness alone might prevent the world from shattering further. "Who is your mother, child?" Garrett asked finally, his voice low like rumbling earth before tremors. She swallowed hard, her throat appearing fragile beneath the grime smeared across her skin. "Catherine Rose. Catherine Rose Bennett. They abandoned her at the cottage near Willow Creek. She cannot rise. Please, sir. Please assist her. Catherine Rose Bennett." The name tugged at him like a half-remembered melody. He had glimpsed her occasionally in the settlement. A woman with gentle features dulled by exhaustion, her gaze consistently lowered when her husband stood nearby. Nathan Bennett was his name. Broad across the shoulders, but swift with liquor and swifter with his fists. Garrett had witnessed Nathan once berating her in the trading post, his hand hovering too near her face, and she had withered like grass beneath boot heels. Garrett had turned away, as most men did, not from malice, but from the old frontier truth. Another man's household was not territory to invade, even when cruelty reigned. Yet hearing her name now from the lips of her daughter pierced him deeper than the winter wind. He crouched low, porch boards groaning under his bulk, so his considerable height wouldn't alarm the girl. "What's your name, little one?" I asked. "Sophie Rose," she whispered. Garrett observed her eyes glisten, though tears refused to fall. He studied the bruises marking her small arms, the way she clutched the torn fabric of her dress as if it might offer protection. Something hardened within him, then not rage, loud and blazing, but a quiet fury running deeper, like fire concealed in tree roots. "Come inside," he instructed, rising to full height again. The girl hesitated, as if uncertain whether to trust someone so large, so stern. But when the wind gusted and nearly knocked her sideways, she stepped past him into warmth. Garrett pulled, his coat tighter, and strode into the night, his boots carving a steady path through snow. Willow Creek lay a mile distant through bare cottonwoods that rattled like skeletal remains. The cold pressed sharp against his face, yet his steps never wavered. He carried no lantern, trusting the pale wash of moonlight and his own knowledge of the terrain. The cottage emerged from darkness, a sagging ruin of logs and broken shingles. Smoke long vanished from its chimney. He pushed the door open, wood groaning on rusted hinges. Inside, the air reeked of damp straw and stale whiskey. In the corner, upon a makeshift bed of rags, lay the woman Catherine Rose. Even in shadows, her injuries told their narrative. Her cheek was swollen, discolored purple, one eye nearly sealed shut. Her lips bore the split of a heavy hand. Her arms showed marks of rough handling, wrists raw where rope had burned. Yet her gaze, when it lifted to him, carried no supplication. It held pride, steadiness, as though she would rather perish on the floor than beg another soul for mercy. Garrett stepped closer, his shadow filling the cramped space. Catherine Rose's voice emerged hoarse and thin. "You shouldn't have come. They'll speak ill. They'll destroy you." He knelt slowly, the floor protesting beneath his weight, and looked into her battered face. "Let them speak," he murmured. He slid his arms beneath her with a gentleness that contradicted his size, lifting her as though she weighed nothing at all. Her breath caught at the sudden movement, yet she didn't resist. She closed her eyes, perhaps from shame, perhaps from the strange safety she felt in his grasp. He carried her through the snow. His coat wrapped around her slight frame, her head resting against his chest. The storm seemed to soften its howl as they moved, as though even winter paused to observe. At the cabin, Sophie ran to the door, her small hands clasped tightly together. When she saw her mother in Garrett's arms, her face illuminated with relief. That made her seem both years older and years younger simultaneously. He carried Catherine Rose inside and laid her gently upon his own bed, the only bed in the cabin. She stirred, whispering faintly that she couldn't take his place, yet he silenced her with a quiet shake of his head. Sophie climbed onto the bed. Beside her mother, tucking herself close, her thin body trembling from the day's ordeal. Garrett moved to the hearth, building the fire higher, flames crackling vigorously. He fetched water, tore cloth, and with rough yet careful hands, began cleaning Catherine Rose's wounds. She flinched but never cried out. He worked in silence, the kind that spoke more than words ever could. Each gesture said what his lips did not. "You are protected here, and no hand will strike you again." Outside, snow fell heavier, blanketing the prairie in white. Yet within that cabin, a fragile warmth took root. Sophie's breathing softened into sleep beside her mother. Catherine Rose's eyes, half closed with weariness, flickered once to Garrett as he sat by the fire, his broad shoulders bent forward, his face lined by both firelight and something deeper. Loneliness, perhaps, or the quiet ache of someone who had carried too much silence. She wanted to speak, to thank him, yet the weight of shame held her tongue. Still, for the first time in years, she closed her eyes with a small measure of peace. But peace was a fragile thing in those lands. Already in the tavern across town, Nathan Bennett's voice carried loud and bitter, slurring over spilled whiskey. He told anyone who would listen that his wife had been stolen, that Walsh had taken her into his bed. He spat Garrett's name with venom, vowing to reclaim what was his, to make the giant bleed for shaming him. Men muttered and nodded, eager for drama, for scandal, for a tale to tell through the long winter nights. Back at the cabin, Garrett rose from the fire, looking down upon the sleeping mother and child. Something stirred in him he hadn't felt in years, not desire, not yet, but the raw pulse of responsibility, belonging. He stepped to the window, pulling back the curtain. The prairie stretched dark and endless, the snow lit faintly by the moon. Somewhere out there, he knew Nathan was sharpening his anger. Garrett's jaw tightened, his hand rested against. She woke to the smell of boiled cornmeal and broth, simple but steady food that Garrett prepared with clumsy hands. He wasn't someone of kitchens, yet his silence carried into the way he stirred the pot, into the way he set the tin bowl beside her without comment. She would murmur thanks, her voice barely more than a thread, and he would nod once. Returning to his place by the hearth, as though he feared his presence might overwhelm her, Sophie rose. Ever watchful, clung close to her mother, her small hand always seeking Catherine Rose's, even in sleep. But slowly, as the days stretched, the child's eyes began to wander toward Garrett. She watched the way his giant hands split wood, the way his boots thudded against the floor, the way his shoulders seemed broad enough to shield the cabin from the storm itself. In her heart, a quiet trust was forming, not spoken, but lived in the way she dared to smile when he offered her a carved wooden figure, a little deer whittled in the evening silence. She held it tight as though it were gold, whispering to it its sleep beside her on the pallet near the fire. Catherine Rose noticed these small things, though she didn't let her gaze linger long. Shame pressed heavy upon her, heavier than the bruises Nathan had left. To be in another man's home, to be under his care, meant whispers would be born in town before the week was out. She knew the way of gossip. She had heard the cluck of tongues even before the blows began. Women muttering of her husband's temper, of her weakness in never leaving him. Now those same mouths would shape sharper words: fallen woman, shameless, unfit. The knowledge settled on her like frost. Garrett felt the weight too. Each time he hitched his wagon to haul hay or rode into town for supplies, eyes followed him. Men in the saloon spoke low, though not so low he couldn't hear. Women paused their sewing on porches, their glances sliding like knives across his back. He said nothing. He had lived with silence long enough to let it armor him. Yet inside, when he returned to the cabin, the air seemed softer, filled with Sophie's laughter as she tried on his hat, or Catherine Rose's quiet hum as she stirred broth. Those sounds carved through his solitude in ways no gossip could undo. One morning, the church bell tolled across the frozen plain, summoning the faithful. Garrett hitched his wagon, deciding the child deserved the warmth of prayer, and the woman deserved to feel the world again, even if it judged her. Catherine Rose resisted, clutching Sophie's hand. "They will stare," she whispered. Garrett met her gaze, his dark eyes steady. "Let them." And so she dressed in her plainest shawl, hiding the worst of her healing face, and climbed into the wagon with her daughter pressed close. The church was small, wood-worn smooth by years of weather, its windows frosted white dot inside. Warmth from the stove met the chill of suspicion. Conversations faltered as Garrett led Catherine Rose to a pew near the back. Children peeked over shoulders, their mothers tugging them away with whispers. Reverend Mitchell, old and grave, lifted his sermon, but his eyes lingered a beat too long upon Catherine Rose, as though weighing her presence. She bowed her head, cheeks burning. Sophie fidgeted, looking to Garrett for comfort. He rested one large hand on her shoulder, stilling her with the simple weight of his presence. After service, Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, ever the sharp tongue, cornered Catherine Rose at the steps. "My dear," she said with a smile too sweet to be kind, "it must be hard to endure such trials. Perhaps it would be more fitting if you stayed with kin. Folks are talking, you know." Catherine Rose, already trembling, found her voice falter. Garrett's shadow fell across them, his gaze heavy upon Adelaide. Without a word, he stepped closer, his silence sharper than any rebuke. Adelaide's smile faltered. She muttered something about prayer and scurried off, her skirts brushing snow. That night, Catherine Rose sat by the fire, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I've brought ruin upon you," she whispered. "They'll never forgive this." Garrett looked up from the wood he was carving. His voice came slow, steady. "It isn't forgiveness I'm after. It's peace." Her breath caught, for no man had spoken to her that way in years, not as something broken, not as something owned, but as someone worthy of peace. She turned away quickly, hiding the flush of warmth that crept into her face. Days folded into one another, marked by snowfalls and the crackle of firewood. Catherine Rose began to regain her strength, rising from bed to sweep the floor, to mend Garrett's worn shirts with careful stitches. She moved slowly, but with purpose, presence filling the cabin not as burden, but as life. Garrett found himself pausing in his chores, listening to her soft humming as she worked, a sound that seemed to knit the cabin walls tighter. Yet the outside world grew sharper. In the saloon, Nathan Bennett's voice rang loud. His pride stung deeper than his fists had ever struck. He spat that Walsh had stolen his wife, that she belonged to him, that no giant could hide her away. Men laughed, some mocking Nathan, others feeding his fury. He drank deeper, promising he would ride out, gather men if need be, and drag her back by her hair if that was what it took. The sheriff. Weary warned him to keep peace. But Nathan only sneered. News of these words reached Catherine Rose through whispers in the store. She returned to the cabin pale and shaken. "He'll come for me," she told Garrett, her hands trembling as she tried to untie her bonnet. "He'll never stop." Garrett set aside his work, his jaw hard. "Let him come," he said simply. His words carried no boast, no anger, only a certainty that made her heart quiver. For the first time, she believed Nathan might indeed be stopped, though the thought brought both relief and terror. Sophie, sensing the storm, clung tighter to Garrett. One night, she crept from her pallet to where he sat carving by the fire. "You won't let him hurt Mama again, will you?" she whispered. Garrett lifted her into his lap, his great hands holding her gently. "Not while I draw breath," he said. The child pressed her head against his chest, listening to the deep, steady beat of his heart. She fell asleep there, safe at last. Catherine Rose watched from the bed, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She had once believed all men carried violence in their hands. But here was one who carried a child as though she were glass, who tended bruises with reverence, who bore shame in silence, rather than let it fall on those weaker than him. Something fragile and dangerous. Stirred within her a hope she had buried years ago, but hope was a fire that drew shadows. One evening, as Garrett returned from town with supplies, he found a note nailed to his door. The words scrawled, crude and angry. "She's mine. Bring her out, or I'll bring men to take her." Garrett tore the note down, crumpling it in his fist. He looked into the cabin where Catherine Rose stirred soup, where Sophie played with the wooden deer upon the floor, and he felt the line of his life shift. He could no longer pretend this was only shelter, only kindness. The world had chosen sides, and by opening his door to the broken, he had declared his dot. As snow thickened outside, the cabin glowed with firelight, fragile and warm. Yet beneath that warmth, a reckoning drew near, carried on the hooves of a man who would not rest until his pride was fed, and in the silence before sleep, Catherine Rose whispered into the dark, half to herself, half to the man who sat unmoving in his chair. "You'll lose everything for me." Garrett didn't answer. He only stared into the fire, his jaw set, his eyes reflecting the flames. The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters, as though the land itself braced for what was coming. The storm announced itself first with a low moan. Across the prairie, a sound that carried in the distance like the warning of a great beast stirring from slumber. Garrett Walsh felt it before the sky broke, an ache in his bones, a pressure behind the stillness that made the cattle restless in the far pasture. The air turned sharp, laced with a scent of iron and snow, and the horizon thickened with a black weight rolling steadily closer. He worked quickly to secure the barn doors, the rope taut beneath his hands, his breath fogging in the deepening cold. Behind him, the cabin stood against the gray like a solitary sentinel, its windows already glowing faintly with fire. For word had reached him in town earlier that day. Nathan Bennett, fueled by drink and wounded pride, had sworn before a circle of men that he would reclaim his wife. He spat venom into every glass, boasting that he wouldn't come alone, but with others who carried his bitterness, men glad to fan the fire of scandal into flame. Garrett hadn't answered the talk, yet his silence hadn't been mistaken for fear. Those who saw the set of his jaw, the stillness in his eyes, knew the giant rancher was bracing for a reckoning. Now, as the storm thickened, Catherine Rose sensed the weight upon him. She stood by the fire, her shawl pulled tight, her face lit by the flicker of flame. "Do you think you will come in this weather?" she asked softly, though her voice carried no hope. Only dread. Garrett looked toward the window where snow whirled like ghosts against the glass. "If a man's rage is hot enough," he said, "even the storm won't cool it." She turned away, her hand brushing her daughter's hair. For so long she had endured Nathan's wrath, bending beneath it, surviving, but never resisting. Now the thought of him returning with others at his back made her stomach knot. Yet there was also something else, an ember of defiance sparked by the sight of her child sleeping warm by a fire. By the knowledge that her pain no longer went unseen, Garrett had lifted her from the dirt. Not with pity, but with a kind of strength that carried no expectation but protection. That ember glowed brighter each day, and though fear pressed heavy now, it didn't snuff out entirely. The hours stretched long. Garrett moved from door to window, checking latches, tightening shutters, every movement steady and measured. Sophie drowsed against her mother's lap, her small breath soft against the storm's roar. Catherine Rose watched the giant man by the door. The way he seemed carved from the same timber as the cabin itself, enduring. She wondered what weight he carried in his silence, what grief hollowed his eyes when the firelight caught them. She longed to ask, yet words failed her. Instead, she whispered a melody to him under her breath, a fragment of comfort from her childhood, the notes soft but steady. Garrett paused at the door, listening. For the first time in years, a sound touched the emptiness within him, a reminder that homes weren't built of logs alone, but of voices that filled the spaces between storms. But the night didn't belong to peace. Near midnight, over the howl of wind, came another sound, faint at first. Then clearer hoofbeats, the crunch of horses through snow. Deliberate, drawing closer, Garrett froze, his hand resting upon the rifle propped against the wall. Catherine Rose's breath caught, her fingers tightening around Sophie. The child stirred, murmured, and clutched the wooden deer tighter. "They're here," Catherine Rose whispered, fear cracking her voice. Garrett didn't answer. He moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutter. Against the swirl of snow, shadows shifted, mounted figures pushing hard against the storm. He counted 3, perhaps 4, their lanterns swaying like willows dash the dash WISPS. One voice cut above the wind. Loud, angry, slurred the voice of Nathan Bennett. Garrett stepped back, his jaw tight, his face carved in stone. He turned to Catherine Rose. "Get her into the back room," he said quietly. "Do not open that door unless you hear my voice." She hesitated, wanting to protest, yet the weight in his gaze left no room. She gathered Sophie quickly, whispering comfort though her own fear quaked, and pulled the child into the small back room where blankets were piled high. The door closed softly behind them. Garrett remained in the main room, the rifle steady in his hands, though he prayed it wouldn't be needed. The storm rattled the walls, yet above it came the pounding of fists against the cabin door. "Walsh," Nathan roared, "you think you can steal what's mine? Bring her out, or we'll drag her ourselves." Laughter followed, cruel and mocking. Though it held a tremor of men seeking courage against the storm and the man inside, Garrett said nothing. Silence was his answer, the same silence that had carried him through loss, through years of loneliness, through every whisper of gossip. He set the rifle against the wall and reached instead for the lantern. He lit it, the flame casting his great shadow across the room. And then he unbarred the door. Snow burst inward, wind howling, yet Garrett stood firm, the lantern raised. The men flinched at the sudden light, their faces raw from cold, their eyes red-rimmed with drink and rage. Nathan sat astride a horse, his figure bloated with fury, his mouth twisted. "You've shamed me, Walsh," he spat. "You've taken my wife, poisoned her against me. I'll see you ruined before this night ends." Garrett stepped forward onto the porch, the storm clawing at his coat, the lantern in his hand casting long shadows. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying even through the gale. "She was never yours to break." The word struck harder than any fist. Nathan's face contorted, rage boiling over. He spurred his horse forward, shouting to the others, "Drag her out." Garrett set the lantern down in the snow, freeing his hands, his body poised. The storm whipped around them, snow stinging like knives. The night alive with fury. Inside the back room, Catherine Rose clutched Sophie close. Hearing the muffled shouts, the crash of boots against snow, her heart hammered, torn between terror and a strange surge of strength. For years she had prayed only to endure. Now, with Garrett standing between her and the storm, she prayed not just for safety, but for the courage to never return to chains. Sophie whispered against her, her small voice trembling, "He won't let them take you, Mama." Outside, the first of Nathan's men dismounted, stumbling through snow toward the porch. Garrett met him, his great frame a wall against the storm. The clash of bodies rang sharp against the night. Fists swung, boots slid, snow scattered. Garrett moved with the power of someone who had labored all his life, each step unshaken. Another man came, and another, yet still he didn't falter. The storm howled louder, as if the land itself bore witness. Nathan shouted curses, circling on his horse, his face twisted in fury as his men faltered. He screamed Walsh's name into the night, yet Garrett's silence was answer enough. The fight raged at the edge of the porch, the lantern light flickering wildly, until at last the men staggered back, bruised, bloodied, their rage cooled by the storm and the unyielding force of one man's defense. But Nathan remained, his pride greater than his fear. He dismounted at last, stumbling forward, snow clinging to his hair and beard, his fists clenched. "This ain't over," he hissed, his voice sharp with madness. "You think you can take her? You think you can shame me? I'll burn this place to the ground before I let her stay." Garrett stood in the snow, his chest heaving, his face lit by the lantern's glow. His silence now held the weight of a vow, his body poised not just to fight, but to endure whatever storm Nathan carried with him. The snow fell heavier still, cloaking the land in white, muffling sound, turning the world into a frozen stage for the reckoning yet to come. And from the back room, Catherine Rose pressed her hand to the door, her breath trembling, her eyes wet with both fear and resolve. She had thought herself broken, powerless. But hearing Nathan's threats, seeing Garrett's quiet defiance, something within her rose fierce and steady. She knew with a certainty as sharp as the winter wind that the next time she faced Nathan, she would not face him in silence. The night held its breath. The storm raging, the men faltering, Nathan and Garrett locked in a standoff of will. The lantern flame flickered, snow hissed against the ground, and the prairie itself seemed to pause, waiting for the blow that would shatter the fragile balance. Snow swirled like torn silk across the prairie, and the lantern flame at Garrett Walsh's feet bent low under the gale, painting light against the storm's furious canvas. Nathan Bennett stood before him, his face twisted with rage. The storm's claws lashing his coat, the beaten men who had come at Nathan's side lingered farther back, their courage already spent, yet Nathan's pride burned hotter than the coal. Their struggle became a dance in the storm, Nathan flailing with the recklessness of someone who feared being small, Garrett moving with the precision of one who bore responsibility greater than his own life. Each blow landed with the weight of more than fists. Garrett saw in Nathan every cruelty carved into Catherine Rose's skin. Every night Sophie had gone to bed hungry, every humiliation endured in silence. And Nathan, in striking Garrett, sought not only to reclaim a wife, but to prove himself unbroken, to claw back respect from a town that had begun to turn its head. They grappled, boots sliding, fists pounding, the lantern light swinging wildly, casting shadows that leapt monstrous across the snow. Garrett's strength held steady, yet Nathan fought like a cornered beast. At last Garrett caught him by the collar, his massive hand closing around the cloth, and slammed him against the porch post. The wood shuddered, snow tumbling from the roof. Nathan gasped, blood streaking his lip, his eyes burning with hatred. "Do it," Nathan hissed. "Break me. Kill me." That's what they'll expect from the giant. That's all you are. Garrett's fist hovered. The storm raging around them, the temptation of vengeance burning hot. But then faint through the howl, he heard another sound, Sophie's voice. Muffled by the cabin walls, a child's cry calling softly, "Mama, is he gone?" That small voice pierced deeper than Nathan's taunts. Garrett's breath steadied, lowered his fist, though his grip remained strong. Killing Nathan would only birth another ghost to haunt Catherine, Rose, and her daughter. Justice wasn't blood upon snow. It was dignity returned. He yanked Nathan forward and flung him down into the drift. Nathan scrambled, cursing, yet Garrett pressed the rifle, barrel never fired, against his chest, forcing him still. "You'll answer for what you've done," Garrett said, his voice carrying into the night like a vow. "Not here, not by my hand, by the law." The other men shifted uneasily. None dared step forward, their loyalty frayed by the storm and the sight of their leader brought low. Garrett dragged Nathan up, gripping him like a sack of grain, and half carried, half drove him toward his horse. Nathan struggled weakly, spitting blood, yet Garrett's silence broke him more surely than any blow. The men mounted without a word, cowed by the giant's resolve. At the edge of the yard, Garrett thrust Nathan into the saddle with a force that left him hanging limp. "Tell the sheriff I'll be bringing evidence by dawn," Garrett said. "And if you return here again, you'll find no storm strong enough to hide you." The men hesitated, then spurred their horses, dragging Nathan with them into the whirling dark. Hoofbeats faded, swallowed by the wind. Garrett stood a long moment in the snow. Chest rising and falling, the storm easing its fury as though satisfied. At last he turned and stepped back inside. Warmth met him, the firelight gentle after the cold. Catherine Rose stood near the hearth, her shawl drawn close, her face pale, yet her eyes fierce. Sophie clung to her skirts, her small wooden deer pressed tight in her hand. When Garrett shut the door, the cabin seemed to exhale, as if the walls themselves had held their breath. Catherine Rose's voice trembled, though not with weakness. "You could have killed him." Garrett met her gaze, steady as stone. "A man like that wants to make you small as he is. He won't break me, and he won't break you again." Her eyes glistened, the fire painting them with gold. For the first time in years, she let herself believe those words. Sophie broke the silence then. Running forward, pressing her little body against Garrett's leg, "You saved us," she whispered. Her voice muffled against him. He bent, lifting her gently into his arms. She curled into his chest as though it were the safest place on earth. Catherine Rose watched, her hand rising to her mouth, not to hide. Shamed this time, but to stifle the sob of relief that threatened to break free. Her life had been nothing but survival, yet tonight, within these walls, she glimpsed something she had thought forever lost. Shelter not of wood, but of trust. They sat by the fire as the storm softened. The world outside blanketed in white silence. Garrett tended the flames, his broad hands steady. Catherine Rose reached for Sophie, yet the child had already drifted to sleep in Garrett's arms. Her small fingers curled in the fabric of his coat. He didn't move her, only looked down, the lines of his face softened by the glow. Catherine Rose's heart tightened a mixture of gratitude and fear. To hope again was the bravest and most dangerous act of all. Hours passed, the storm dying to a hush. Garrett at last laid Sophie on her pallet, tucking the blanket around her. He stood then, facing Catherine Rose across the firelight. No words were spoken,